Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is the podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and I am happy to be with you on this Tuesday at the end of May. Hope you had a wonderful Memorial Day weekend, whether you got a 3-day weekend or a 4-day weekend or no weekend. Still hope you found some way to make it a good weekend. I did. My husband and I had a very lazy weekend. Well, no, actually it was a good combination of lazy and productive, but we did get some laziness in there. It rained a lot, so gave us a good excuse to stay in and binge watch television, which is, sometimes that's a nice way to spend the weekend with your hubby or with your spouse. So we have an interview today with author Richard C. Lyons, and the interview is about his new book, The DNA of Democracy, Volume 1. An American poet writes a compilation of historical vignettes, discerning the future of our democracy by rediscovering the combative, instructive, fascinating past of tyranny and democracy. Just as DNA is interwoven in every aspect of the human body, tyranny and democracy have their historically distinctive DNA that have shaped our democracy today. From Israel's 10 Commandments, to the Athenian Constitution, to Rome's 12 Tables, to the overthrow of kings in England and America, Lyons traces democracy from its historical roots to the modern day, constructing a blueprint of what defines tyranny or democratic government in the DNA of democracy. In this definitive guide, Richard C. Lyons documents the struggle for power between tyrants and heroes across time and place, chronicling the acts of tyrants which are expressive of tyranny's DNA, and the rebellions of heroes and the forms of law which are democracy's DNA. Lyons outlines the roots of democracies by telling the tales of tyrants who ironically gave them births of rebellion. The book serves as a how-to contemporary guide on identifying the menace of a tyrant when you see one. So this is nonfiction. Obviously, it is listed as political science, history, and self-help, which I find a fascinating triumvirate. I'm going to let you listen to the interview to find out where the self-help portion of that comes into play. The book is written as a series of essays exploring different time periods. There's vignettes of each sort of snippet of that DNA of democracy, of instances when democracy was present, was formed, etc. And it's juxtaposed to the tyrants of the world, to the eras of tyranny. And again, Richard's going to explain this more in the interview, but he said that he started researching and looking into it, and there really aren't that many instances of democracy if you look at history as a whole, which I found fascinating because I would say that we pretty much take it for granted here in the United States. It's just the way we live. It's been the system, our whole lives. And while I knew, I guess, somewhere in my brain that Richard is right about the rarity of democracy throughout the centuries, I'd never consciously thought of that. And so that was a really fascinating approach to this book. It is, as I said, written in those essays, in those vignettes. So it's not a quick read as a book as a whole. It's over 300 pages, which is, lots of books are over 300 pages. I'm not getting on the length of it. I'm just saying that it's not necessarily a book that you sit down and read in a couple of hours, but it is a book that you can sit down and read a chapter or an essay or one of those little vignettes and you can do that in a shorter period of time. So that is, I think, one of the things that draws me to this book is just being able to sit down and read a little essay or, I shouldn't say a little, a short, a not very long essay or vignette, learn about a specific time in history and the democracy therein. I've mentioned before that I was a history major in college, so for me, this book was fascinating. If you are interested in history or political science, then you should definitely check this book out. And as such, I do have copies of it to give away, so stay tuned to the end of the podcast to find out how you can enter to win a copy of the DNA of Democracy. This is what happens when I try to say things and I'm looking at the cover of the book. I say copacy. You can win a copy of the DNA of Democracy by Richard C. Lyons. So let's go ahead and turn to that interview now with Richard, and he can tell you more about the book.
Hi, Richard. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Sarah. Good to be here.
It is great to have you here, and we are here to talk about your new book, The DNA of Democracy. Before we get to the book, though, I'd love for my listeners to get to know you a little bit. So if you could share something about yourself.
Yes, I was born in the Midwest and raised there, and my education has been mostly self-achieved outside of institutions. I did many things for a living in my life. Most notably, I was in the printing industry for a number of years and in publishing. And so that got me into writing.
Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about the book. It's called The DNA of Democracy. What was your inspiration for the book?
I came to notice, I have a working knowledge of history. And I came to notice how rare democracy is and how fragile it is. So I thought, the more people who know the basics about the foundations of democracy, the better democracy might thrive. So I thought I'd try and write something that was inspirational, that was entertaining, that was informative, that gave people, and it could be anybody, just a basic background in all the things necessary that were to the building of democracy in history.
Mm-hmm. And so the book is written a little differently maybe than some other typical history books. It's written as a series of essays. Can you talk about your decision to structure the book that way?
Sure. There is. They are historical vignettes, and there's some essay type writing in it, as well as some philosophical points in political science. So it is a little bit different in structure, but the vignettes we go through and the essays we marry to them reflect one another, so that the action of the work is reflected in steps persons took in history to create a democracy in answer to the tyranny that gave democracy birth.
Yeah, and actually I really like the way it's structured because when you think about a history book often, and I was a history major, so I can speak to this, it can be a little daunting sometimes to pick up a history book and read it, but this is structured in a way that you can read those vignettes, as you call them. You can just sit down and read one and then pick up the book later and read another one and kind of move through it like that. So I really appreciated that about the book.
Yeah, I have a lot of friends who take the train into the city in Chicago, and they had always told me how much they enjoyed reading on the train. So I envisioned doing the vignettes in such a manner that on your way into the city you can read a vignette and then the outcome of what that created in history, and on the way home read another. So that they're none of them too long, they're not too complicated, they're more entertaining, but they're real history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So what kinds of research then did you do for the book? Because it covers quite of a large expanse of time. So what was your research process like?
Well, I had a working working knowledge of history, and I started with the source, and the source of law, at least in Western society, is the Ten Commandments. So you start with that, and then you turn to Athens for the history of democracy and what was done there, so many years ago. And that began with Isagoras trying to exercise a tyranny that was unexampled in Athens when he told half the property owners and half of the people of the city that they were to be dispossessed because they were cursed, and that all of his friends and family were not, so that they would be able to take over the lands of those who were. It was quite an act of tyranny, and when the people were just aghast because they were used to kind tyrants. This one decided to be a mean one, and so their answer was to throw him out, though he was defended by a Spartan army.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the episodes in the histories, and I thought it interesting.
I'm going to jump in here and say that the phrase kind tyrant always kind of grabs my attention because, yes, of course, there are tyrants who are kind. There are tyrants who are not kind. There are tyrants who are everything in between. But when I think of the word tyrant, kindness is not the first thing that comes to mind. So it is another fascinating look at through history of the different types of tyrants that have existed. We are going to take our first break of the podcast. When we come back, we'll be talking more about the DNA of democracy. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Always on the go, but the day just won't be one without your Hollywood fix. Let Golden State Media Concepts Entertainment Podcast take care of that. An all-inclusive look of pop culture.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with author Richard C. Lyons about his new book, The DNA of Democracy. So let's go ahead and get back to that interview.
You just said the phrase "kind tyrant," which I don't think a lot of people listening might think that is an oxymoron. So the book really does juxtapose tyranny and democracy. Can you talk a little bit about the tyranny side a little more?
Well, the tyranny side, it is what I call the common keep of humanity, and it's been exercised since the days of the pharaohs, when a pharaoh controlled literally everything. And you can see it. You can see it today in Cuba. You can see it being attempted in Venezuela, though there's many rebellions there. You can see it done in China, where a person or a party of people or an oligarchy controls all the machinery of state and all the machinery of commerce, and therefore you either are benefited by that tyrant or you are dismissed, and you're not cared for or cared about. You're just a tool. That's the basic difference between state governing a country and a country that is a democracy is one based on each individual doing what they would to benefit themselves, to better their lives, as opposed to a government saying, I want you to succeed, and because you will be my friend, you will continue to succeed. And the converse of that is, if you are not my friend and you don't do what I'm telling you to do, then you're the enemy, and you'll be treated like that.
Right.
So it's a basic difference.
Absolutely. Is there a particular essay or a time period that you studied during your research that caught your attention, more than some of the others?
Well, I came upon a young couple during the American Revolution that I thought were very interesting, and it was Henry and Lucy Knox. And they were a young couple in Boston. Her family, Lucy Knox's family, was very loyal to the British, believed in all things British and in the Empire. But she witnessed with her husband Henry the Boston Massacre, and they noticed how things were changing in the lives of their friends who were not so allied to the British. They owned a bookshop which was a favorite of the Tories in that they had collections brought over from England specifically. So it was a prized bookstore. It was frequented by the upper echelons of British society. And Lucy, because she saw what was going on in Boston outside of her family's loyalties and outside of British sympathy, decided with Henry in a night to abandon the bookshop, abandon their very nice home, their affluent life, her family, and go over to the rebel side, having no experience of being a rebel. And what happened from there was that Henry Knox, who was a bibliophile, had studied engineering with regard to the military. And so he was put in charge of the mission to take Ticonderoga's weapons and move them to Boston to get the British out of Boston and their occupation. And he was able to do it in one of the greatest logistical feats of the war. But during the period when they were exiled from their bookshop, Lucy didn't have a dime. So she was in the rebel camp without a family, without a home, without an occupation. I thought the sacrifice of that example was just remarkable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. And I actually feel like I just read, but I feel like in the last couple of years I read a historical fiction book that had them as minor characters. I'll have to figure out what that was. They seem like a very interesting couple.
Yeah,
so the book.
The reality
go ahead.
of what they gave up was something.
Yeah, absolutely. The book has illustrations throughout. Can you talk a little bit about that and why you chose to include illustrations in the book?
Yeah, I found a really good guy called Robert Venables through some research. And when you talk about government, it goes to architecture. It's the architecture of a government that rules your life. And so, or it's an architecture through which individuals rule themselves. And so the architecture of the pyramid came to mind because it is the symbol of the pharaoh in more than just what his burial ground is. It was their method of rule and the common method of rule of all tyrants, in that they put themselves at the very top. Everyone beneath is dependent upon them, and their force really works vertically, keeping everything, all the pressure going down to the ground. Whereas in America, something unique happened. And that was that all the subtler powers in society, having no government above them, when they settled in America, the powers of the family came through, the power of the individual, the power of enterprise, the power of associations, such as educational and religious associations. Those took the fore, as opposed to having any tyrant above who dictated how they could build things. And so the structure in America became that of an arch as opposed to a pyramid. And an arch symbolizes an architectural structure held together by the interdependence of independent associations.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you. And did you work closely with the illustrator, or kind of just give the illustrator the ideas that you had for the pictures? And
well, we worked very closely, but it was I had to relay to him the vision of what I was talking about, and he produced sketches. Then I approved a sketch, and then we fine-tuned sketches to finished product.
Mm-hmm. Okay. On the back of the book, it lists the book under political science, history, and self-help, which I found really interesting. Talk a little bit about the self-help portion.
Well, I thought that was fun, but it's really true. In that, in a democracy, the democracy affects all people individually, and all individuals affect the democracy. So you're really a part of the government. And what better help can you be to yourself than having a working knowledge of how to help the government, or your place under it, or within it, should say, not under it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I thought it was fun, and I think it's very true. The more you know about democracy, the more you know about the system of government, the more you can help yourself.
Right. And what's the saying? Those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it?
Right.
Yes.
That's true.
So kind of piggybacking on that, what do you hope readers will take away from the book?
Well, I hope they get a sense of all the sacrifices that were necessary to create democracy, and it's only been created very rarely in very few places at very few times in history, and it took enormous sacrifice to create it. As I say in the book, it's something like a recessive gene. It only crops up now and then, but the dominant gene for humanity has been tyranny. So I wanted to convey the sacrifice that was necessary to democracy's creation. I wanted to convey the cornerstones that are necessary to allow a democracy to continue and sustain itself. And I wanted to convey uses of tyranny and how that inveigles its way into human society.
Let's go ahead and take our second break of the podcast. When we come back, we will be talking more about the book, more about Richard's other writings, writing in general, advice for aspiring authors, all of those questions that I like to be nosy and ask of my authors. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion to my interview with author Richard C. Lyons.
And this is the first volume in a series. So what will the next volume explore?
Well, the DNA of democracy sets the underpinnings for what democracy is and how it was built and its occasions in history. Volume 2 is going to look at the dangers which can threaten a democracy and how they cannot always be seen outright in the form of a invasive army. It can happen within a society by weakening democratic institutions. And so Volume 2 will go into that, and then there will be a Volume 3 called the Dynamics of Democracy, and that will go into natural human condition and the tendency of human characteristic within a democracy, and how they can be either good or bad.
All right. And do you have a time frame for when the second volume might be released?
The second volume will be out in the summer of 2020, and then the third will be a couple years after that.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
And I know that you've done other types of writing, a lot of different other types of writing. Are there any of your writings that you would like to highlight?
Well, I did a work called But by the Chance of War a couple of years ago, and it received critical success without having commercial success. It's more of it's an old world epic type structure, but I thought the work worthy of reading by persons who would be attracted to your podcast, actually.
And say the name of that again?
It's called But by the Chance of War. It's an old phrase from Shakespeare's Henry IV.
All right, thank you. And then when did you start writing? Is it something that you've always wanted to do?
Well, I was actively working for a number of years in printing and publishing, and we had occasion in my family. We had a family business that was reorganized at a certain point, and it freed me up to get into writing. I always had a knack for it. I always loved reading. I really appreciate, the characters in history who have been literary, such as Nathaniel Hawthorne or Emerson and the like. And so I took up writing and found it was not easy at all. So it takes a lot of sacrifice itself to create a literary work.
Yeah, absolutely. And your biography says that you are also a poet and a screenwriter, which is so you've done a lot of different types of writing.
Yes,
how
correct.
did writing The DNA of Democracy? How is that different or similar to the other types of writing that you've done?
Well, it goes to all my likes, one of which you share, which is history. And political science has always been of interest to me, being from Chicago. That has a certain dynamic in city government.
Yes.
that I studied, when I was very young in high school. So that's always been of interest to me. And then the storytelling, you want it to be, emotive, and you want it to move people. So I thought the little vignettes I do of history would be applicable to that. And it all worked. And from my poetical background, I was able to pick some very good quotes from noted authors and philosophers from history that I had in the vault of my researches.
Nice. So then, out of your unique experience of writing and all the different types of writing that you've done, do you have advice for aspiring authors?
My experience is that writing is not easy, and it's the easier if you're well read. And once you're well read, you can pinpoint what you need to read, and you have to develop a style, and the style comes with after many attempts, your style gets honed and perfected. And I wish anybody well who takes up writing. It's not easy. We're living in a world that's more visual than textual. So success is not so easy.
And do you have a different perspective coming from the publishing side of the world? Because you've done it from both sides. So do you have any advice coming from the publishing side of the world?
I do. If you want to get forward as a writer, it's important that you pick a good editor, that you have a good team, and that you respond well to criticism, because it's going to happen. And the more criticism you listen to and allow to affect how you write, the better your writing becomes, because from that conflict arises a better writer and a better editor.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned being well read. So do you have favorite authors and genres that you turn to?
I have the classics. I love Homer. I love Plutarch. I love Shakespeare, Milton, all the romantics on either side of the ocean. And Michael Crichton, of modern authors, I thought was he is a great modern writer with a touch that's just excellent. His attention to detail was fantastic, and his writings adapt very well to the screen. And in this day and age, that's a positive thing if you want to make a living as a writer.
Yeah.
Not just you can be a writer and just make it an artistic venture, which is wonderful, and it's very expressive. If you want to make a career out of it and support yourself and perhaps a family, I would look to Michael Crichton's writings as an exemplar.
Okay. I think you are definitely the first author who has mentioned Plutarch when I asked this question.
Right?
Yep. So,
well, I
nicely
used
done.
him as a reference, in the DNA of Democracy. Plutarch was a Greek who lived in about 100 A.D. and just was a fantastic historian, and he wrote a series called The Lives of Noble Romans and Greeks, and it formed during a period of my researches for DNA of Democracy. And when I studied the Revolutionary era and the Romantic era in Europe, he was basic reading for all the persons who had to do with constructing our form of government.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and his name comes up all the time, and he's often quoted. But
yeah, and a lot of people say, "Who's that guy? Why does he only have one name?" So he was the Elvis of historians for a couple of millennia.
Nice. I love that.
No, he was that popular, and
right.
People should, they should read one life of his just to get an example of how he wrote. It was stellar.
Yeah. Sorry, now I have this image of people just like screaming and cheering as he comes on to some stage somewhere.
And reaching for the peanut butter.
Oh, jeez. Okay, so I know that you have a website, so tell people the website and where they can find you on social media.
Oh, sure. The website is Lylea.com. It's spelled Lylea.com. And on there are my various works over time. And so anybody can visit that. And I also have a Facebook page. So if they search for Richard C. Lyons, they'll find me. And my works are available anywhere you look for such work. Okay. And we're coming up with an Audible book in the next week for DNA of Democracy.
Oh, wonderful. Do you know who the narrator will be?
Oh, no. I produced the Audible
you did it.
book.
Oh,
and it's,
perfect.
Oh, yes. It's Eileen Stevens, and she is just an absolute professional. And what a narrator. She just... I listened through the book, and I thought I'd tire of it because I know it so well. I was glued. She's that good. And then we had Jay Lustek to provide a compliment, and he does some readings of all I call them masterpieces of democracy, and they're the works such as the Declaration of Independence or the Emancipation Proclamation. I had Jay do those readings because his voice lends to that.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And you said that's coming out in a week or so?
In about a week. Yeah, I should have it up on. It should be up by Tuesday.
Okay.
But we'll see. I have to make sure it comes up before I say that.
You're right. So people can look for the book, or they can look for the audiobook, which is great.
The audiobook, yeah.
Yeah. I listen to a lot of audiobooks in the car, so.
Yeah, and everybody, I have a number of relatives and friends, and I say, well, I'll get you a copy of the book, and they say, well, are you doing an audiobook? And I said, sure. And they said, well, I love to listen to that in the car or on the train. And I said, sure, I'll get you that instead.
Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah, it's becoming a dominant mode of learning.
Yeah, I used to never want to do audiobooks. I always just wanted to read the book myself. But then as time became a factor, I've learned that I can supplement with audiobooks. So I've grown to love them. Yeah.
You'd love this one. I hope you pick it up, Sarah.
Yeah, I'm planning on it. So we've talked about quite a lot of things, different topics. Is there anything else that we haven't covered or that you would like to highlight that you'd like people to know about the book or writing?
No, I just hope everybody likes the book. I think it's very approachable. To speak of doing the Audible book, we had a crew in the sound studio, and when we finished up the work, everybody in the crew said, "You have made this very approachable." I didn't know, a couple of persons said, we didn't know what democracy was really, or what the history of it was. And the beauty of the book, I think, is it just deals with that narrow range and that one timeline of democracy. It doesn't have all the clutter of all the other histories of all these empires and things. It's very clear. It shows tyranny and it shows democracy, and why the one is different from the other, and why democracy is hard to come by and hard to keep. So I hope people take that away from the book.
Yeah, as a follow-up to that, one of my thoughts as I was reading it was that I think growing up here in the United States, we just tend to take it for granted. And so when you talk about how rare it is, it's something I guess I knew when I really thought about it, but I don't think about it that often. It's just the reality here. So the rarity of it was really what jumped out at me from the book.
Yeah, and that takes us back to the first question, what inspired the book? And that was it. I sat down one day, and I had just listened to an interview of someone, a college student, and they didn't seem to have a really firm grasp of what democracy was and why it was different. And then I thought, well, how often has there been democracy? And the number of times have been so few that they are remarkable. So I thought I'd put them together.
Yeah, absolutely. Richard, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today about your book. The book is The DNA of Democracy, and it's available now. It's available soon on audiobook. So thank you so much.
Right. Well, thank you, Sarah. I appreciate your time.
So thank you once again to my guest, Richard C. Lyons, talking about his book, The DNA of Democracy. Thank you, as always, to you, my listeners. If this is a book that you are interested in, I would encourage you to check it out. I would also encourage you to enter to win a copy of this book, The DNA of Democracy, Volume 1 by Richard C. Lyons. I know I've said it before, but I'm going to say it probably a couple more times before the end of the podcast. I just want to make sure you know the name of it. If you are interested in winning a copy of this book, all you have to do is go to our social media pages, the GSMC Book Review Podcast Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram page. Those links are in the show notes, the show description of this episode. This episode is episode 156, Interview with Richard C. Lyons. So go to one of those social media pages, and we're going to make it a little different this week. Comment, as usual, to win a copy, but also make sure you like the post as well. So comment and like. I would love it if you would share the episode as well. That's always appreciated. But in order to be entered into the contest to win a copy of The DNA of Democracy, you need to comment and like this time. So thank you once again to you, my listeners. Thank you again to Richard C. Lyons for taking the time to speak to me about his new book. Hope you're having a great week so far. Join me again on Friday for another episode of the GSMC Book Review Podcast. In the meantime, get out there and get yourself lost in a good book. Thanks.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.